Welcome to Classic Take, episode 18. Today we will discuss the prediction of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. The title of today's talk is Miracle or Science? Will the resurrection of the dead happen in the laboratory? We are living in times which, in a certain sense, are unprecedented in scientific discoveries and advances in science, and many things that the Torah predicts regarding the future, it's possible sometimes to interpret it in a scientific manner. For example, our sages tell us that when Mashiach will come, trees will give fruit every day, or there will be bread growing from the ground. So technically, there's different explanations what this means, what it represents, and so on and so forth, but there is a certain school of thought who attempts to interpret these based on advancements in modern science. We have the ability, we could genetically modify wheat or to cause that loaves of bread should grow from the ground. We could find a way of making things grow quickly on trees, that trees will give fruit every day. So there's a general discussion, which is not limited to the resurrection of the dead, but the general discussion of these predictions, should we try to interpret them in a scientific way or not? And the answer to my personal approach is, there's always a possibility of interpreting them in a natural way, but the meaning of these statements when they were said wasn't just that at one day humans will figure out through scientific discovery how to reach this point. The predictions about the future weren't just that it will become one day that we'll reach such advancements in our understanding of the universe that we will be able to have a easy life. The meaning of these predictions are much deeper than that. So, for example, there's a general dispute between the Rambam and other Mefarshim, other commentators, other opinions regarding other predictions about the future. For example, this prediction that I just mentioned, that the land of Israel will produce ready-made food and clothes, the Rambam says it's all metaphoric. It doesn't mean literally that there will be ready-made bread growing from the ground, that there will be clothes growing on the trees. He says it means that life will be so easy, that it will be so easy for a person to make money, so easy for a person to find the necessities of life, that in people's talk and people's slang, they will use the words, oh, it grew from the ground. And like we find something, even today we have this thing of something we find so easily. We say it fell down from the sky. It doesn't mean that it fell down from the sky. It's the way of people talking. Similarly, the Rambam says that when Mashiach will come, it will be so easy to get things for a person to find his needs that it will be, in the way people will talk is as if it grew out, or the bread grew ready-made from the ground. Doesn't necessarily mean that this is exactly how it will be. Now, according to the Rambam's approach, 100%, the door is open to interpret many of these predictions and to interpret them to me, that will be scientific discoveries that will make these things happen. The Rambam completely interpreted in a completely metaphoric way. It doesn't mean literally at all. I don't think the Rambam would obviously object to somebody trying to interpret the verse in a literal but natural manner, that there will be a scientific discovery that will cause this to happen. On a similar note, the Rambam also discusses another prediction regarding the future. It says, V'gor ze'evim keves, that a wolf will dwell together with the sheep. And the Rambam says that this verse is to be understood metaphorically. It means that the nations of the world, which are compared to wolves, 70 wolves, and the Jewish people that are compared to a sheep, will live in peace and harmony when Mashiach will come. It doesn't mean that the animal, the predator, the wolf will live peacefully with the sheep. It's a metaphor. It's allegorically. It doesn't mean it wasn't meant to be understood literally in the first place. And that's his school of thought regarding this particular verse. Many others, Gedolei Yisrael, many other great sages completely disagree with the Rambam. You have the Ravid, the famous commentator on the Rambam, who on this halacha right away says that he doesn't accept this approach of the Rambam. And the Ramban also he disagreed with the Rambam. Many others disagreed with the Rambam, and they do interpret the verse in a literal way. Now, the Rambam himself wrote a famous letter, Yigeres Tchias HaMesim, where the Rambam explains a little bit more his approach to these verses, when he approaches something literally, when doesn't, when he interprets something literally, when he doesn't interpret something literally. And Rambam says regarding this verse, he says that if you look at the verse, the Rambam argues it should be self-understood that it was never meant to be said literally. The verse says how the animals will live in peace with each other, and the verse continues, they will not hurt each other because the world will be filled with the knowledge of Hashem as water covers the sea. The Rambam says, do animals have knowledge because could they understand about godliness? Obviously, we're talking about human beings hurting each other. We're not talking about animals hurting each other. We can't say that animals are being affected by knowledge. So the Rambam says the context of the verses themselves tell you that you should understand it allegorically. It's self-understood, the Rambam claims. But then the Rambam goes further. The Rambam says, I'm not saying that it has to be has to be interpreted allegorically. It could happen literally. It's not that he believes that there's something inherently against Judaism to interpret it literally. He just gives a whole discussion of, he explains that he doesn't believe in the approach of trying to say the miraculous things that will happen for no reason, etc., etc. And he discusses his approach to miracles, how Hashem created the world in a natural way. Miracles are a temporary change of nature. There's no need to interpret a verse and to try to create the fantastic meaning of something when it could be understood within the context of the subject matter. It will be understood much better to interpret it allegorically, etc., etc. It's an idea which Rambam explains in a few places. And Rambam says, I could accept, other interpretations of the verse as well. The Rambam says, for example, it could be, he says, a hypothetical interpretation of the verse that when the human population expands and animals find themselves, in different habitat and other circumstances than they were used to, so they're going to have to start eating, instead of eating other animals, they'll have to start eating straw maybe. The verse says, and the lion will eat straw like cattle. So the Rambam mentions that some philosophers, didn't mention this idea that it's possible that, through the change of the habitat of animals and their ability to get prey, they might have to change also the types of food that they eat. So the Rambam says, perhaps if you want, you could explain the verse in this way. And then the Rambam says, if you want to explain it as a miracle, he says it could be a miracle that will happen, on the Har HaBayis, on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, whatever it is. Just like the Mishnah says that that when the temple stood, it was a miracle that no snake or scorpion harmed anybody in Yerushalayim. So the Rambam offers a variety of different approaches. He mentions the approach that he prefers, and he explains why he prefers that. He says at the same time you could interpret it in other ways that also, so to say, make sense, have a context. And so according to the Rambam, we see that he definitely accepts interpreting certain predictions, certain phenomena as miracle, as which sound miraculous, as maybe just, there'll be a natural change within the world which will bring this about. And the point that the prophecies would be making is either they'll be explaining how human population will grow, or how, we'll be able to live life easier, etc., etc. So definitely, according to the Rambam, these verses, these types of predictions could be understood allegorically. The sages that disagree with the Rambam, so for them, I would just point out that in their viewpoint, to say that these predictions will be fulfilled simply through a trick, a game that's played by modern science, doesn't seem to be really correct. And the reason is because those sages who disagree with the Rambam, at least many of them, their approaches, they believe that inherently, naturally, the way the world was created before the sin of the tree of knowledge, that Adam Rishon sinned with the tree of knowledge, animals weren't meant to eat up one another. They were meant to live in peace with one another. The fact that today there's wolves are eating up sheep and lions eating up other animals is a unnatural state of the world, so to say. This is something which was introduced by the sin of knowledge. So according to them, they understand all these predictions, these fantastic predictions about the future, also within a certain context. Now, the Rambam said that you have to understand the verses in context. They do have a context. They're not just, The Rambam didn't like people that are just trying to come up with a la la land, with things that sound fantastic without any substance to it. But those Mekubalim, though, the Ramban and the Ravid and others who do interpret these verses literally, they actually have a very strong context. It's maybe not a context that the Rambam would agree of. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But they have a context. The context is that they believe that all these verses are trying to tell us that the negative changes that were introduced into creation due to the sin of the tree of knowledge will be eradicated. And in their understanding, which is not necessarily the Rambam's understanding, but in their understanding, in the understanding of Kabbalah and maybe even the literal interpretation of the verses as understood by many, is that the world, when it was originally created, was 100% good, 100% peaceful. There wasn't room for one animal to eat up another animal, and so on and so forth. And this was changed due to the allowance of negative elements of creation to enter into humans, into animals, which took place through the sin of the tree of knowledge. So in all these verses are speaking about the wonderful predictions of the future, how the wolf will be at peace with the lamb, and so on and so forth, and the earth will give out ready-made food. They understand this, that the world will revert to its a true natural state, the way it was meant to be all along. Now, it's self-understood, according to that interpretation, it's not just that we're genetically modifying the world as we know it today, and we're going to insert a gene in a wolf which will make it tame and it won't prey on the sheep. I mean, the reason, according to this understanding, the inherent nature of a wolf wasn't that he should eat up the sheep. There was there was a negative energy that was brought into creation, which changed the nature of the sheep, which changed the nature of the wolf and other predatory animals. So in essence, according to them, saying that it'll just be a trick of modern science is really undermining the true meaning of what these predictions really mean according to their understanding. So, but again, as I mentioned, there's different interpretations, there's different ways of looking at things. There's obviously room for this type of understanding to interpret verses in light of scientific discoveries, at least according to the Rambam or others. There'll definitely be room to do that. Regarding the particular discussion at hand, the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead is one type of thing which the Rambam himself makes it very clear that he believes it is a miracle, and we have to believe it will happen in a literal sense. And that's actually why he dedicates this whole letter, Vigeres Tchias HaMeisim. One of the things he's trying to explain is that people thought that he holds that there won't be resurrection of the dead in a simple sense. It will just be maybe the Rambam, some people suspect that the Rambam is interpreting in some allegoric way that the soul will go to paradise, but not that the dead will be resurrected in the literal sense, in the literal meaning of the word. And the Rambam said that he holds, like any religious Jew, that this is a fundamental of Jewish belief, that the souls will return to their bodies. And the reason the Rambam says why he feels compelled to accept that this is so, I mean, besides the fact that it's part of Jewish tradition, as he says, the basis for this is because there are certain verses that cannot be interpreted allegorically, while some verses, based on the context, you could explain them and interpret them in an allegoric way. The verses that speak about the resurrection of the dead, at least one or two of the verses, cannot be interpreted allegorically. You could try to do it, the Rambam says, by a stretch of imagination, you could try to do that. But for that matter, you would have to say that all the miracles of the 10 plagues in Egypt and the splitting of the Red Sea was also, as speaking about allegorical events taking place, which the Rambam says goes against the basic Jewish belief. The basic Jewish belief is that God could perform miracles. So if somebody says, I believe that God could perform miracles, but I believe that this verse, the context of the verse is not talking about a miracle, because that's not what the context seems to be saying. The context of the verse seems to be telling me that I'm supposed to interpret it in an allegorical way. Okay, that's fine. I'm not negating the fact that God could do miracles. But when there's a verse that the straightforward meaning of the verse is that God will perform a miracle, and somebody says, no, I want to interpret it allegorically, the Rambam says, what is pushing you to do that is because you have an issue with God doing miracles. Why do you have an issue with God doing miracles? Because the Rambam says, it's a separate discussion, but the Rambam ties the belief in miracles with the belief that the world was created by Hashem. Hashem created the world, not that the world always existed as some philosophers believe, but that Hashem created the world, Chidush Ha'olam, So then with that belief, automatically you have to believe that God could do miracles at any time he wants. Those that did not believe in miracles, it was because they inherently did not believe that God has the power to do whatever he wants in the world, because God didn't create the world out of his own free choice at a certain time in history. So therefore, the Rambam says ultimately belief in the resurrection of the dead equals the belief in miracles. And the Rambam says that is the reason. This is what the Rambam himself says about why he included the resurrection of the dead within the 13 principles of faith, because the Rambam says that I included it to highlight the importance of believing in miracles. Because belief in miracles is synonymous with the belief that God controls the world, was synonymous with the belief that God created the world. So this is what the Rambam says. Now, the question still is, does the Rambam hold that there's no way of resurrection happening in a natural way? So there's interesting discussion about this. Obviously, modern science didn't reach there yet, but I'll just discuss a few points regarding this. I mean, it's time. There's a lot to discuss, but time aligned. I want to highlight a few points. There is a number of sources, the sefer called Halachos Ketanos, that is one of the sages in his day, Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz, if I'm not mistaken. So he writes over there, he says that he makes a distinction between two types of dead that are being resurrected. He says there is those people that died natural death, or whatever, unnatural death, but they died in their regular time. They died, they were buried. And he says that the same way when they were born the first time was a natural birth, so similarly he says that their resurrection is also natural. Why? He brings a famous teaching of our sages that in Sanhedrin in chapter 10, the Gemara dedicates a whole discussion regarding the belief of the resurrection of the dead and different debates that Jewish sages had with people that didn't believe in it or people that questioned it. And one of the famous lines in that passage of the Gemara is that when it was a logical argument brought to prove the possibility of the resurrection of the dead, which is if somebody that didn't exist, Hashem could bring him into existence, right? Any time a new baby is born, his body never existed before, it was formed for the first time when this baby is born. So he says, lo havu, somebody that did not exist was brought into existence. How much more so once something was already brought into existence, it shouldn't be so hard to bring him back together again. So he says that in a certain sense, he says you could consider such a resurrection. We don't know exactly how or what that means, but I guess his argument is that we must say that to some extent it was already programmed within the DNA of the body that it could be brought back to life again. However, he says, what about somebody that died or in an unnatural state, meaning that or somebody that wasn't buried, an animal devoured somebody, or whatever, somebody's body was completely destroyed. So in such a sense, he says, such a resurrection is completely miraculous. So he says in the future, when there'll be the resurrection of the dead, again, it's all relative what he means, natural and miraculous, but he says some bodies, some people, you could say somewhat natural. However, the resurrection of the dead is going to encompass everybody, even people that their bodies were completely, they were eaten up by other animals, whatever it is. And even such people, Hashem will bring them back together. And this is a miracle. This is clearly a miracle. This is not something that could be done with, this is something which is only God himself could do. Now, the sages, the medieval sages, you have already Rapsadi Goin, you have many Jewish thinkers have actually delved a lot into the question, how will the resurrection of the dead take place? Like the question that they ask is if there's a body that was completely, let's say the example I just gave, a body, somebody, an animal ate up a dead body, so there's nothing left of the body. How will Hashem bring it back together? And there's a whole, a lot of philosophical discussions about this, which is interesting discussion. It's not for now. The final accepted understanding is that there's something called, at least according to some, something called the luz bone, a certain bone in the body, which is a whole discussion, what it is, where it is. but it's a certain bone in the body which can never be destroyed, will always, whatever happens to the body, that tiny remnant of the body will always remain intact. And that will be the starting point from which the body will be brought together. That always remains intact. And Hashem, there's a tal tchiyah, there's a dew of resurrection that Hashem will bring in the future. And from there, the body will be brought back together. There's other opinions. There's a Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, another midrashic source, which actually says that it's not, the body won't be resurrected from the loose bone, but it will be. He says that it will be the rot of the body decomposed, the decomposed earth will be resurrected into the as again. But either way, the accepted understanding is that it will be happen through a loose bone, so there'll be something left of the body, even those bodies that, the way some commentaries put it is that even a body that was completely decimated, destroyed, nothing left, there's always somewhere, somehow, this loose bone that remains, and from there the body will be resurrected. Now, how will that loose bone be resurrected? Is it something we could understand naturally? I don't know. There's our sages speak about a tal tchiyah, a godly dew that will come down to resurrect the dead. The Bar Benel in a few places understands the dew to be similar to a male and female, where there's just like a body to begin with is formed by a male and female. Similarly, he says the dew and the earth will have similar characteristics, and this dew that comes, this godly dew, and will form the body just like a body starts forming in its mother's womb, and that's how resurrection will take place. Other commentaries don't accept the Bar Benel's understanding. They say, we're obviously talking about a miraculous thing. They object to his attempt to try to explain it somewhat in natural scientific terms. But either way, we will find out when Mashiach will come. But definitely the belief in Tchias HaMesim, could be it's possible. It's actually, there's a interesting, it's not very famous, but there was a chassid, Rabbi Avram Weingarten. He would take notes. He learned in the 1950s and 770. He would take notes from what different chassidim said. So some of it was published, some of it wasn't. So I've seen there that he writes that he heard from Rab Shmuel Levitin that chassidim had, when they split the atom, when they dropped the atom bomb at the end of the Second World War. So he told the other chassidim that he heard from elderly chassidim that before Mashiach comes, scientists will figure out a way how to resurrect the dead. Okay, I mean, I know when cloning came out, I was arguing with somebody whether cloning could be considered a form of resurrection or not. I mean, it's maybe, in a certain sense, it doesn't sound really to be the resurrection, because one of the premises of resurrection is that it's going to be the same body. Hashem will take the original body that disintegrated and bring it back, not just will take a cell from the body and make a different body out of that. It's the first body will come back. Either way, the bottom line is this is definitely something which is a pillar of Jewish faith. Definitely, it doesn't have to be natural. It's obviously something which we believe. It highlights the bli gvul, the infinite capabilities of Hashem. Perhaps there is a natural way of doing it, but some people, as we've seen before, those commentaries that make a distinction between different dead bodies that do remain, that don't remain. But either way, whether it definitely to some degree will be miraculous, and we should experience speedily in our days. Amen.